Today's video is a detailed review and analysis of the movie The Scorpion King, starring The Rock. This is not a full movie and not a movie screening. In this video, we will break down the complete story of the film and explain how the plot develops from start to end. We will talk about the main cast and supporting cast, their roles, and their performances. We will also cover the movie's production, development process, and the creative choices behind it. You will learn where the story was inspired from, who wrote it, and what the original idea and purpose were. Along with the creative side, we will analyze the movie's budget, box office performance, and overall business results. Every important element of the film is explained and reviewed from a viewer's perspective. So let's begin and take a closer look at the Scorpion King. The desert sun beat down mercilessly on the endless sands of the Acadian lands. War drums echoed faintly in the distance, a reminder of the eastern horde sweeping across the tribes. Matthias, a young and determined warrior, rode alongside his half-brother Jessup and their loyal friend Rama, their eyes fixed on a horizon clouded with smoke from distant fires. The Acadians had survived countless skirmishes, yet this day felt different. The wind carried whispers of doom, of a conqueror whose power seemed unstoppable. Memnon, the ruthless king from the east, had already crushed the local tribes, his armies leaving no survivors, his sorceress Cassandra predicting every move of their enemies. No one dared challenge him, fearing the wrath of his dark magic. Yet Matthias' spirit refused to bow. Their mission was simple, yet deadly. Infiltrate Memnon's camp, assassinate Cassandra, and strike a blow that could give hope to the scattered tribes. King Pharon, ruler of the free tribes, had placed his trust in them, a decision that could cost lives or change the fate of their world. Rama, Jessup, and Matthias shared a glance of silent understanding of the danger ahead. The desert stretched endlessly as they approached the camp under the veil of twilight. Shadows moved unnaturally, hints of guards patrolling with deadly precision. Their careful steps brought them close, yet treachery lurked in unexpected places. Takmet, Pharon's own son, had betrayed his father, alerting Memnon's men to the Acadians' presence. A trap awaited them. Chaos erupted as arrows flew from hidden towers, cutting through the evening air. Rama fell first, his scream swallowed by the wind, leaving Matthias and Jessup exposed. Jessup was seized by the enemy, his struggles futile against the overwhelming force. Matthias, heart pounding, pressed forward, determined to reach Cassandra despite the carnage around him. He found her in the inner tent, chained and weary, yet her eyes held a flicker of defiance. Matthias spared her life, a choice that would ripple through destiny itself. Before he could react further, Memnon's guards descended upon him, dragging him into captivity. From the corner of his eye, he saw Jessup executed, the scene etched into his mind forever. Buried up to his neck in the shifting sands, Matthias faced certain death as fire ants crawled relentlessly toward him. Pain and desperation threatened to overwhelm him, yet survival instincts surged. A fellow prisoner, Arpid, a skilled horse thief with cunning beyond his years, offered a lifeline, helping Matthias escape the desert's grasp. Vowing revenge, Matthias swore to finish what had begun, to defeat Memnon, rescue Cassandra, and honor the memory of his fallen brother and friend. He journeyed across the treacherous desert, learning the strength of his body and the sharpness of his mind, every obstacle forging him into a weapon destined for greatness. The sands whispered stories of a warrior rising, one who would come to be feared as the Scorpion King. Reaching the fortified walls of Gomorrah, Memnon's stronghold, Matthias enlisted the help of a clever street urchin to navigate the labyrinthine passages of the city. Phyllis, the court magician who harbored a conscience, quietly guided him toward the courtyard where Memnon trained, a place where destiny would collide with determination. Yet, even as Matthias prepared, unforeseen dangers forced him to rescue the urchin, turning escape into an intricate dance of survival. Cassandra, now free under his protection, traveled alongside him. A fragile alliance formed, strengthened by unspoken trust and the burgeoning sparks of love. Memnon's warrior Thorak, with his venomous scorpion stings, pursued relentlessly, culminating in a deadly clash within a cave as a sandstorm raged outside. Matthias triumphed, though poisoned, testing his resolve and fortitude beyond the limits of ordinary men. Cassandra's magic healed him, her faith in him unshakable. She revealed the truths of Memnon's tyranny, urging Matthias to embrace his destiny as the only one capable of bringing peace. Together with Arpid and Phyllis, they prepared an explosive plan, a combination of skill, ingenuity, and courage designed to topple the tyrant king. Yet betrayal and ambition shadowed every step, as the Nubian king Balthazar sought his own claim to power. Matthias faced Balthazar in a duel of strength and strategy, earning reluctant respect and sanctuary for his courage. Cassandra, through visions, glimpsed futures both grim and glorious. Total annihilation by Memnon's hand, and Matthias' own demise confronting the tyrant. Yet hope and resolve guided him forward. Destiny was his true shape. As dawn broke, Matthias and his allies launched a daring assault on Gomorrah, arrows cutting through the morning haze, warriors charging with relentless determination. Takmit fell by Balthazar's hand, vengeance for Farron executed flawlessly amidst the chaos. Matthias, wounded yet unyielding, faced Memnon atop the fortress, every arrow, sword, and spell a testament to human courage against tyranny. The final confrontation saw Cassandra intervene, fate entwined with the hero's skill, allowing Matthias to retrieve his bow and pierce the tyrant's heart. Explosives detonated, collapsing the palace foundations, and Memnon's army yielded before Matthias' leadership. He had risen from the desert sands, from betrayal, and from loss to become the Scorpion King. Peace followed, fragile and fleeting. Yet Matthias' resolve remained unbroken. Cassandra warned of future turmoil, but the hero smiled, claiming that destiny belonged to those bold enough to seize it. The sun set on Akkad, painting the desert gold, heralding the era of a new king, the Scorpion King, whose legend would echo across time and kingdoms. The wind carried the acrid scent of smoke and blood across the scorched lands surrounding Gomorrah. Matthias, scarred yet unbroken, surveyed the ruins of Memnon's fortress from a nearby ridge. The sun blazed overhead, glinting off the remnants of steel and stone, a testament to the chaos that had unfolded. Cassandra stood beside him, her eyes reflecting both awe and fear. The battle is won, Matthias, but the war, it has just begun, she said, her voice barely rising above the desert wind. Matthias nodded, his jaw set, determination etching deep lines into his face. Arpid approached, carrying supplies and tending to minor injuries. The loyal horse thief, ever resourceful. The men speak of you already, he said, glancing around at the surviving rebels. They whisper the Scorpion King, he added with a grin, a spark of respect in his eyes. The title felt strange to Matthias, yet it carried weight, a mantle he could not yet fully embrace. But even as the rebels celebrated small victories, the shadow of Memnon's legacy lingered, his loyalists scattered, but far from defeated. A new challenge loomed on the horizon, one that would test Matthias' cunning and courage like never before. They moved at dusk, traveling along hidden paths, avoiding detection from the remnants of Memnon's forces. Cassandra's magical senses guided them, revealing traps and ambushes laid out across the desert, remnants of the tyrant's foresight. Each step forward was a step into danger, yet also a step toward vengeance and justice. Memnon's lieutenant, Thorak, though slain, had left followers who now scoured the lands, seeking retribution. Matthias' heart hardened as he thought of Jessup and Rama, of the lives lost to the cruelty of men driven by power. Every arrow, every blade, every ounce of strength will be for them, he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. By nightfall, they reached the ruins of a Nubian encampment, where King Balthazar awaited with wary eyes. The rebel king had been testing Matthias' resolve, weighing him against the treacheries and ambitions of men. Respect was earned through deeds, and Matthias' display at Gomorrah had tipped the scales in his favor. Balthazar extended a hand, a silent gesture of alliance, though suspicion lingered. Your skill is undeniable, Matthias, but you walk a dangerous path, he said, voice low, careful. Matthias took the hand firmly, yet his gaze remained on the horizon, wary of unseen threats. That night, under a canopy of stars, Cassandra revealed the visions that haunted her dreams. Scenes of destruction, of Matthias falling before Memnon, of entire camps being slaughtered in moments of merciless fury. Yet within the visions, she also glimpsed hope, a chance to change fate through courage and unity. They plotted by the dim light of a fire, mapping out strategies and contingencies. Arpid scrawled diagrams in the sand, showing paths through mountain passes and desert valleys, potential ambush sites and escape routes. Phyllis joined them, his knowledge of explosives and war machines vital to the plan that would challenge Memnon's remaining forces. The next day, Matthias trained with the rebels, honing skills that had already carried him through impossible trials. Each movement, each strike of his blade, carried the memory of his brother and friends, their deaths fueling his resolve. Cassandra watched, her heart torn between fear for him and awe at the strength he exhibited. In the midst of training, scouts returned with news. Memnon's loyalists had regrouped in a nearby stronghold, preparing to strike at unsuspecting tribes. The urgency of action settled over the camp like a storm cloud, and Matthias rose to the challenge. his voice commanding yet steady. "We move at first light," he declared. No mercy for those who would spill innocent blood. The journey to the stronghold was perilous, the terrain unforgiving, yet Matthias led with unwavering precision. Desert winds whipped their faces, sand clawing at eyes and skin. A natural trial complementing the dangers of men armed with blades and dark magic. Cassandra's powers provided guidance, revealing hidden traps and warning of ambushes. Yet she, too, sensed the heavy cost that lay ahead. As dawn approached, the silhouette of the enemy fortress emerged, jagged against the rising sun. Scouts confirmed that Memnon's forces were well prepared. Yet Matthias' strategy relied on speed, deception, and the element of surprise. The rebels tightened their grips on weapons, their eyes filled with anticipation and fear. Matthias' plan was simple in theory, but perilous in execution. Infiltrate the stronghold from the rear, disable key defenses, and strike Memnon's lieutenants to create chaos. Arpid, agile and cunning, would lead the diversion, drawing enemy patrols away from the main assault. Phyllis would handle explosives, targeting the walls and gates to maximize disruption. They moved under the cover of early morning shadows. Every step measured, every heartbeat synchronized with the tension in the air. Matthias felt the weight of destiny pressing down on him, yet it was a burden he bore willingly. The first guards fell silently, their deaths swift, almost merciful compared to the carnage that would soon erupt. Inside the fortress, Matthias confronted enemy captains, each duel a test of skill and nerve. His movements were precise, lethal, honed by training, grief, and the fire of vengeance. Arpid's diversion worked flawlessly, drawing reinforcements into narrow corridors where they were easily dispatched. Cassandra's magic amplified the chaos, illusions and minor spells distracting foes, creating openings for Matthias and the rebels. The fortress became a maze of smoke, fire, and steel, every corner a potential death trap. Yet, Matthias pressed on, his mind focused solely on the objective: reach Memnon, confront his tyranny, and end his reign. At the fortress gates, Balthazar and his warriors engaged the enemy, a clash of titans echoing across the valley. The sounds of battle, screams, and the clash of weapons reverberated through the desert, mingling with the cries of those who had suffered under Memnon's oppression. Matthias felt the pulse of history in his veins, knowing that the outcome of this battle would shape the destiny of entire kingdoms. Hours passed in relentless combat, the sun climbing higher, scorching the earth and the warriors alike. Matthias fought with the precision of a predator and the resolve of a man who had lost everything and had nothing left to fear. Every strike, every kill, every act of bravery brought him closer to the moment he would face Memnon himself. Matthias stood atop a dune, surveying the battlefield below, his cloak whipping in the wind. Every heartbeat echoed with the memory of Jessup, of Rama, of the innocents lost to Memnon's cruelty. Cassandra approached quietly, her eyes scanning the horizon, wary of both magic and man. "We cannot fail now," she said, voice steady but tinged with fear. Matthias nodded, the weight of leadership settling onto his shoulders, heavier than any armor he had ever worn. Arpid and Philos moved through the shadows, preparing the explosives that would turn the tide of battle. The rebels assembled, faces determined, eyes burning with the desire for justice and vengeance. Each one knew the cost of failure, death, or worse, the continuation of Memnon's reign. As the first arrow of dawn pierced the air, Matthias led the charge, moving like a phantom across the sands. Every strike of his blade was precise, cutting through guards with lethal efficiency. The fortress trembled under the combined force of strategy, skill, and sheer willpower. Cassandra's illusions created chaos among Memnon's troops, making them see shadows where there were none. Magic collided with steel, screams echoing, horses rearing, soldiers falling to sand and blood. Phyllis ignited the explosive charges, collapsing walls and gates, the fortress crumbling piece by piece. From the rubble emerged Balthazar, leading the main rebel army, charging into the enemy with a roar that shook the valley. The clash of steel rang out, a symphony of war and defiance against tyranny. Matthias fought through corridors, each step closer to Memnon, fueling a fire that no blade could extinguish. At last, the throne room loomed, vast and shadowed, where Memnon awaited with arrogance and cruelty. Thorax's absence was felt, yet the memories of those who had died at Memnon's command spurred Matthias forward. The floor was strewn with guards, fallen soldiers of both sides, the air thick with dust and the metallic scent of blood. Memnon rose to meet him, eyes burning with the confidence of a man who had never known defeat. "You dare come here, Acadian," he sneered, voice echoing off stone walls. Matthias did not speak. His silence was a challenge more deadly than any words. The duel began with a clash of blades, steel sparking against steel, each strike a dance of death and skill. Memnon's power was formidable, yet Matthias moved with the precision of a predator, every motion honed by loss and vengeance. Cassandra's magic fled from the doorway, enhancing his strikes, creating openings that only a master could exploit. Outside, the fortress continued to crumble under Philos' explosives and Arpid's guerrilla attacks. Rebels pushed forward, engaging the remaining soldiers, freeing captives and rallying allies once oppressed under Memnon's rule. The desert around Gomorrah seemed to burn with the heat of battle, as if the sun itself were witnessing history. Matthias struck with lethal force, disarming Memnon, knocking him to one knee. "You will not survive this day," Memnon hissed, blood streaking his face, eyes blazing with fury. Matthias' response was a single motion, an arrow loosed from his bow, striking with unerring accuracy, a symbol of justice incarnate. Memnon's army faltered, their leader defeated, their morale shattered. Balthazar and the rebels surged forward, overwhelming the remaining forces, bringing the tyrant's reign to an abrupt end. Matthias stood victorious, chest heaving, body battered, yet spirit unbroken. The title of Scorpion King now etched into legend. Cassandra approached, her face a mixture of relief and admiration. "You did it. You truly are the Scorpion King," she whispered, placing a hand upon his arm. Matthias looked out over the valley, seeing freedom for the first time. The tribes no longer shackled by fear. Arpid and Philos joined them, smiles on their faces despite the exhaustion and scars of battle. The desert wind carried the cries of victory, echoes of a people reclaiming their destiny. Matthias felt the weight of history upon him, understanding that power was not in fear, but in the courage to face impossible odds. Even as the celebration began, Cassandra warned of future challenges, visions of war and chaos lingering in her mind. Matthias accepted them with stoic determination, knowing that peace was fleeting and leadership required vigilance. Yet for this moment, victory was theirs. The Scorpion King had risen, and the desert sang a song of liberation. Matthias stood atop the highest dune, surveying the valley, the winds carrying whispers of victory and the scent of scorched earth. He had defeated Memnon, claimed the title of Scorpion King, yet he knew leadership was only beginning. Cassandra approached silently, her eyes alert, scanning the horizon for threats yet unseen. "Memnon is gone, but his allies might regroup," she warned, voice steady yet tinged with concern. Matthias nodded, understanding that peace was fragile, a prize that required vigilance and strategy. Arpid and Philos moved among the tribes, helping rebuild shattered communities, sharing knowledge of tactics, supplies, and innovation. The tribes looked to Matthias for guidance, their trust forged in battle and cemented by courage. Even Balthazar, once a rival, now extended his hand in alliance, respect earned through the fires of war. The Scorpion King convened a council, bringing leaders of every free tribe together beneath the shade of massive sandstone cliffs. Maps were spread across the rough-hewn tables, detailing trade routes, tribal borders, and potential threats beyond the desert sands. Each voice was heard, concerns addressed, strategies debated. Matthias listened carefully, weighing every word. Cassandra's visions occasionally haunted him, fleeting glimpses of betrayal, rebellion, and foreign invaders. Yet Matthias relied not on fear, but on the strength of unity, the discipline honed from years as an Akkadian warrior. He knew that power was meaningless without loyalty and purpose among the people he sought to protect. News arrived that some of Memnon's distant lieutenants had regrouped near the eastern mountains, attempting to rally scattered mercenaries. Matthias immediately ordered a reconnaissance mission, led by Arpid, and a contingent of the most trusted fighters. The scouts returned with troubling intelligence. The enemy was building fortifications, recruiting deserters, and preparing to strike back. Cassandra suggested a diplomatic approach, sending envoys to the rebel commanders, testing their willingness to surrender before bloodshed. Matthias agreed, believing that survival often required cunning as much as brute strength. Yet he remained prepared, knowing that those loyal to Memnon were unlikely to abandon ambitions so easily. Meanwhile, Philos experimented with new technologies, improving weapons, developing siege tactics, and creating defensive fortifications. Every invention and strategy Matthias adopted strengthened the tribes, turning a collection of survivors into a formidable coalition. The desert itself became a weapon, its terrain, hidden caves, and narrow passes used to the Scorpion King's advantage. Rama's memory lingered in Matthias' mind, a reminder of the cost of war, the value of each life, and the necessity of courage in leadership. Jessup's sacrifice fueled his resolve, the burning desire to ensure that their deaths were not in vain. and Cassandra remained at his side, a partner in both strategy and heart, guiding, advising, and sometimes challenging him. A messenger arrived from the northern tribes, bearing news of raids and disturbances, likely linked to Memnon's remaining allies. Matthias immediately dispatched a group of elite warriors, including Arpid and select tribal leaders, to intercept them. The scouts reported back. The rebels underestimated the Scorpion King, and many surrendered without a fight when faced with his reputation. However, not all were easily swayed. A particularly ruthless commander, Kelley, refused to bend to Matthias' authority, vowing vengeance for Memnon's death. This defiance prompted Matthias to plan a decisive campaign, blending diplomacy with precise military action. He led the first wave himself, demonstrating his skill, courage, and unyielding presence as both warrior and king. Cassandra's magic provided an advantage, veiling the army's movements, creating illusions of larger forces, and disorienting Kelley's followers. Matthias moved through the chaos like a shadow, striking swiftly, incapacitating enemy leaders with minimal bloodshed. The battle was over by sunset, Kelley captured and convinced to join the coalition, securing further unity among the tribes. With the immediate threats subdued, Matthias turned his attention to the broader region, forging alliances with distant leaders, consolidating trade, and establishing protocols for mutual defense. The people began to see him not just as a warrior, but as a ruler capable of vision, strategy, and justice. Even Balthazar expressed admiration, acknowledging that Matthias' leadership had restored hope to a land once ruled by fear. But peace remained tenuous. Cassandra revealed visions of a new enemy rising in the south, one that would challenge both strength and wisdom. Matthias resolved to prepare, training the youth, fortifying positions, and creating networks of intelligence to detect threats before they arrived. He understood that being the Scorpion King meant bearing the burden of vigilance every hour, every day. Despite the weight of responsibility, Matthias found moments of respite with Cassandra, their bond deepening amidst trials, strategy, and shared victories. They walked the desert sands together, discussing future plans, dreams of a unified land, and the possibility of enduring peace. The Scorpion King's legend grew, whispered in every camp, sung by every tribe, a symbol of defiance, courage, and the promise of a better future. The Scorpion King's dominion stretched across the desert, each tribe now united under his banner, their loyalty hard-earned through courage, diplomacy, and shared survival. Matthias walked among the people, observing the markets, training grounds, and communal spaces, noting both the prosperity and the vigilance that came with newfound freedom. Even in moments of calm, he remained aware that power was never absolute, that every victory invited challenges from beyond the horizon. Cassandra approached him with a map and news from scouts patrolling the southern dunes. Reports indicate unusual activity near the southern oases, she said, her voice calm but alert. Matthias studied the inked lines and markings, frowning. These are not wandering raiders. Someone is organizing, preparing Arpid, polishing weapons at the edge of the camp. Overheard them and stepped closer. This could be the remnants of Memnon's forces, or perhaps a new warlord entirely, he said, tension lining his features. Phyllis nodded, adjusting a prototype of his defensive devices. Whatever it is, they will find the Scorpion King ready. That evening, Matthias convened a council with Balthazar, tribal leaders, and his trusted warriors. We face a force we cannot yet gauge, and it comes from the south, Matthias announced, laying the map flat on a table of rough-hewn sandstone. The leaders murmured among themselves, their expressions a mixture of fear and determination. Cassandra explained that scouts had observed fortified encampments, armed men drilling in formations, and strange banners not belonging to any known tribe. They are disciplined, trained, and moving with purpose, she said. This is more than a raid. It is an organized invasion. Matthias leaned back, thinking, then we must meet them before they consolidate, before their numbers grow beyond control. Arpid and a team of elite riders were dispatched first, tasked with reconnaissance, moving swiftly across the southern dunes. They reported back that the southern leader, a man named Kelley, had united rogue mercenaries, deserters from Memnon's army, and even foreign assassins, forming a force of formidable size. Kelley was ruthless, cunning, and ambitious, seeking to claim the desert as his own, believing the Scorpion King's reign would crumble under pressure. Matthias, Cassandra, and Balthazar devised a strategy that balanced defense with calculated offense. We cannot underestimate them, Balthazar warned. Their numbers alone could overwhelm the desert tribes if we do not act decisively. Phyllis suggested traps and fortifications along narrow passes. using the terrain to neutralize Kellen's advantage in numbers and mobility. The Scorpion King led a group of hand-picked warriors southward, moving under the cover of night to avoid detection. Cassandra used her magic to cloak their movements, bending shadows and light to mask the group's presence. The desert stretched endlessly, silent except for the whisper of sand and the distant howls of predators. A landscape as unforgiving as the men they were about to face. Upon reaching the southern border, Matthias sent Arpid ahead with scouts to gauge enemy strength and identify weak points. The report confirmed his worst fears. Kelley had constructed fortified camps, set up patrols, and positioned archers to guard choke points. "The man is methodical," Arpid said, returning to Matthias. "He studies maps, predicts our moves, and prepares contingencies." Matthias clenched his fists, determination hardening in his eyes. "He believes he can match the Scorpion King in both strategy and might," Matthias said. Cassandra placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "Then we will show him why his ambition is misplaced." The first encounter was at a narrow pass, flanked by sheer cliffs. Matthias' forces engaged Kellen's vanguard, a clash of swords, shields, and wills echoing across the rocky walls. Despite being outnumbered, Matthias' superior tactics and the unity of his warriors turned the tide, forcing the enemy to retreat into prepared fortifications. Phyllis explosives created controlled landslides, blocking secondary routes and funneling Kellen's troops into the open, where Matthias and his fighters could strike with precision. Arpid led flanking maneuvers, cutting off escape routes, while Balthazar coordinated archers to harass and weaken the enemy. Cassandra used her magical illusions to create the appearance of a larger army, sowing confusion and fear among Kellen's soldiers. The battle raged for hours, with sand flying, shields splintering, and swords clanging in relentless rhythm. Matthias confronted Kelley directly, meeting the warlord on the central rise of the battlefield. Their fight was brutal, a combination of skill, strength, and tactical maneuvering, each anticipating the other's moves, neither yielding. Finally, Matthias disarmed Kelley, pressing his blade against the warlord's chest. "You sought to overthrow the desert, yet you underestimated those who fight with unity and purpose," Matthias said, voice steady, yet carrying the weight of authority. Kellen's army, witnessing their leader's defeat, laid down their arms, surrendering to the Scorpion King's mercy. With the southern threat neutralized, Matthias returned to the tribes with Cassandra, Arpid, and Balthazar. Victory was celebrated, yet Matthias remained vigilant, aware that each triumph brought new challenges. That leadership was a constant balance of strength, strategy, and diplomacy. The desert tribes looked to him not merely as a warrior, but as a beacon of unity, the embodiment of justice and foresight. In the aftermath, Matthias visited the young warriors he had trained, instilling discipline, confidence, and the knowledge that power without wisdom was hollow. Cassandra shared visions of distant lands where whispers of unrest began to surface, hinting at future trials that would test the Scorpion King's abilities beyond the desert sands. Matthias accepted the weight of destiny, understanding that every decision, every battle, and every alliance would shape not only his future, but the survival of the tribes under his protection. The victory in the southern desert did not bring silence to the world beyond Matthias' kingdom, because power had a strange way of echoing across distant lands, reaching ears that had never seen the Scorpion King but had already begun to fear his name. Across the eastern frontier, traders, mercenaries, and wandering tribes carried stories of a warrior who had risen from the sands and united the desert under one banner, a king forged through battle rather than birthright. Some spoke of him with admiration, others with suspicion. But the most dangerous listeners were the ones who heard those stories and began quietly preparing for war. Matthias stood on the highest wall of Gomorrah, looking toward the endless desert where the horizon blurred into a thin golden line. The wind carried heat and sand through the air, brushing against his armor like a reminder that the desert itself had shaped him into the warrior he had become. Yet, even in that moment of quiet reflection, his instincts told him that peace was only temporary. Cassandra joined him silently, her eyes distant as if they were searching through time itself. "I see movement far to the east," she said softly. "Not an army yet, but something that could become one." Matthias turned toward her, recognizing the seriousness behind her calm voice. "You have seen visions again?" Cassandra nodded slowly, though the uncertainty in her expression suggested the visions were incomplete. "There is a man," she explained, "a leader who believes the desert tribes are weak after years of war. He believes the Scorpion King is only a legend exaggerated by frightened merchants." Matthias allowed a faint smile to appear across his face. "Then perhaps it is time that legend becomes reality for him." Inside the palace, Arpid and Phyllis were already arguing loudly over a map spread across a wooden table. Arpid pointed toward the eastern border, while Phyllis shook his head repeatedly, muttering calculations about supply lines and terrain. Their voices echoed across the chamber until Matthias stepped inside. "What is the problem?" the Scorpion King asked calmly. Arpid straightened immediately. "We have received reports from caravan scouts," he explained. "Someone in the east is gathering fighters." Phyllis adjusted his glasses and leaned closer to the map. "Not just fighters," he added carefully. "Engineers, builders, people who know how to construct siege weapons." Matthias studied the map quietly, understanding the meaning behind those words. An enemy preparing siege weapons was not planning a simple raid. They were preparing for a full invasion. Balthazar entered the room soon after, carrying news from his own kingdom. "My scouts confirmed the same rumors," he said. "A warlord called Zarek has begun uniting tribes and mercenaries beyond the eastern mountains." Matthias crossed his arms thoughtfully. "And what does he want?" Balthazar's answer came without hesitation. "The same thing every conqueror wants: power." Cassandra stepped forward slowly. "In my vision, he stands before a burning city," she said quietly. "The banners of the desert tribes fall one by one." The room fell silent. Every man there understood what Cassandra's visions often meant. They were glimpses of a future that could still be changed, but only through action. Matthias finally placed his hand firmly on the map. "Then we do not wait for him to march on us," he declared. "We go to him first." Arpid grinned immediately. "Now that sounds like the Scorpion King I know." Phyllis sighed, already realizing that his peaceful experiments would soon be interrupted by another war. Preparations began quickly across the kingdom. Messengers rode across the desert, carrying orders to the tribes who had sworn loyalty to Matthias. Warriors sharpened blades, repaired armor, and prepared their horses for long travel. But Matthias did not intend to send an army alone. He intended to send a message. 3 nights later, a small force of elite fighters left Gomorrah under the cover of darkness. Matthias rode at the front, with Arpid beside him, and Cassandra traveling close behind on horseback. Balthazar had sent several of his strongest warriors as well. The journey toward the eastern frontier was longer and harsher than many expected. The land slowly changed from endless dunes into rocky plains, where jagged cliffs cut across the horizon. Strange winds howled between the mountains, carrying the scent of distant storms. Arpid looked around uneasily as they entered the unfamiliar terrain. "I do not like this place," he muttered. "Too many shadows for my taste." Matthias remained calm. "Shadows can hide enemies," he replied, "but they can hide hunters as well." By the time they reached the eastern valley, the truth of Zarek's preparations became clear. Fires burned across a massive encampment, stretching along the valley floor. Hundreds of soldiers moved between tents, while blacksmiths hammered weapons late into the night. Siege towers were already being built. Catapults stood half-finished near the edge of the camp. This was not a scattered band of warriors. This was a war machine. From the cliffs above the valley, Matthias studied the enemy forces carefully. "He has gathered more men than I expected," Balthazar admitted quietly. "Too many for a direct attack." Cassandra stepped closer, her gaze fixed on the camp below. "I see something else," she said. "Fear." Arpid raised an eyebrow. "Fear? They look ready for war to me." Cassandra shook her head. "They follow Zarek because they believe he is unstoppable," she explained. "But if that belief breaks, their unity will break with it." Matthias understood immediately. Victory would not come through brute force. It would come by destroying the enemy's confidence. That night, under the cover of darkness, Matthias and a small group descended silently toward the valley. Their mission was not to fight the entire army. Their mission was far more dangerous. They were going to walk directly into the heart of the enemy camp. Arpid whispered nervously as they approached the outer tents. "If this plan fails, we will be surrounded by an army that wants our heads." Matthias responded with quiet confidence. "Then we simply make sure the plan does not fail." Moving like shadows between the tents, they avoided patrols and reached the center of the encampment where the largest command tent stood. 2 heavily armed guards stood outside its entrance. Inside was the man responsible for the coming war. Zarek. Matthias stepped forward without hesitation. Before the guards could react, he disarmed one and knocked the other unconscious with a single strike. The tent curtain moved aside. Inside, Zarek looked up from a table covered in maps and weapons. He was taller than most men, with cold eyes and the confident posture of someone who believed victory was already his. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Zarek slowly smiled. "So, the Scorpion King finally arrives." Matthias stepped closer. "You gather an army to conquer the desert," he said calmly. I came to see the man who believes he can do it. Zarek leaned back slightly, studying his unexpected visitor with curiosity rather than fear. I have heard many stories about you, he replied. But legends rarely survive the battlefield. Matthias' voice remained steady. Then you should remember this moment carefully, he said, because it is the moment you decide whether your army lives or dies. Outside the tent, the silent warriors of the Scorpion King waited in the darkness, ready for whatever would happen next. Inside, two leaders stood face to face, knowing that the fate of thousands would be decided by what happened in the next few moments. And for the first time since beginning his conquest, Zarek realized something important. The legend of the Scorpion King was not a story told by frightened merchants. It was a very real danger standing directly in front of him. Matthias quietly drew his sword from its sheath, the steel reflecting the warm light of the burning torches inside the command tent. His movement was calm and controlled, but the meaning behind it was unmistakable. Zarek watched carefully, realizing that the Scorpion King had not entered his camp simply to deliver a warning. There was a deeper purpose behind this visit, something that could decide the fate of the entire army gathered outside the tent. Matthias explained in a steady voice that wars between thousands of soldiers often began because of the ambitions of only a few leaders, and that countless warriors would lose their lives for a conflict that could be settled in a far simpler way, instead of letting armies destroy each other across the desert. He proposed a different solution, a single combat between the two leaders themselves. If Zarek managed to defeat him in that duel, then the path to the desert would remain open, and Matthias would not stand in the way of his campaign. However, if the Scorpion King emerged victorious, Zarek would order his army to leave the desert forever and abandon his plans of conquest. For a long moment, Zarek remained silent, studying the man standing in front of him. The proposal was bold, almost unbelievable, because it meant that the entire future of both armies could be decided by a single battle between two warriors. Yet at the same time, the offer carried a strange sense of honor that many soldiers respected. Zarek slowly walked around the table where the maps of the desert were spread out, his mind weighing the risks and the consequences of accepting such a challenge. Refusing the duel could make him appear weak in front of his own warriors, especially when the Scorpion King had walked directly into the center of his camp without fear. Accepting it, however, meant risking everything he had built over months of preparation. Eventually, Zarek's hand moved toward the hilt of his own sword, and a faint smile appeared on his face. Not out of arrogance, but because he finally understood the kind of man he was dealing with. The Scorpion King was not trying to threaten him with an army or frighten him with stories. He was offering a warrior's solution, one that could prevent thousands of deaths if either of them had the courage to accept it. Zarek lifted his weapon slowly and told Matthias that if the desert truly believed him to be its protector, then the desert itself would witness which of them deserved to stand as the stronger king. The decision was made, and within moments, both men stepped outside the command tent, where the gathered soldiers began to realize that something extraordinary was about to happen. The desert wind moved slowly across the valley as thousands of soldiers stood in complete silence, their eyes fixed on the center of the camp where two warriors faced each other. Matthias, the Scorpion King, stood calm and steady with his sword raised, while Zarek tightened his grip on his own blade, understanding that the battle about to begin would decide far more than just personal pride. Every man in that valley knew that the result of this duel could change the fate of entire kingdoms. And the tension in the air was so heavy that even the wind seemed to pause for a moment as the two leaders began to circle each other carefully, studying every movement and waiting for the first opportunity to strike. Zarek was the first to move, stepping forward with a powerful swing meant to test the strength of his opponent. The sound of steel colliding echoed across the valley as Matthias blocked a strike with precise control. Immediately realizing that Zarek was not just another ambitious warlord but a warrior who had survived countless battles. The two blades clashed again and again as the fight grew more intense, sparks flying in the sunlight, while the watching soldiers slowly began to understand that this duel was not going to end quickly. Zarek fought with raw strength and relentless aggression, pushing forward with heavy attacks designed to overpower his opponent, while Matthias relied on speed, experience, and the calm discipline that had made him one of the most feared warriors in the desert. Each movement carried the weight of years spent surviving war. When Zarek attempted a powerful strike aimed directly at Matthias' shoulder, the Scorpion King twisted aside at the last moment and countered with a fast attack that forced Zarek to retreat several steps. A murmur spread through the watching soldiers, many of whom had never seen their commander pushed back in combat before. Zarek quickly recovered and launched another series of attacks. Refusing to allow doubt to enter his mind, But it was becoming clear that Matthias was not simply defending himself. He was studying his opponent carefully, learning his rhythm, and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Across the camp, Arpid stood among the gathered rebels, who had quietly positioned themselves near the valley, ready to act if the duel somehow turned into a larger battle. He watched the fight with a mixture of concern and admiration, shaking his head slightly as he saw the two warriors exchange another brutal clash of blades. Even from a distance, it was obvious that both men were fighting with everything they had, and Arpid knew that a single mistake could end the duel instantly. Beside him, Cassandra kept her eyes fixed on Matthias, her expression tense, as if she could feel the danger surrounding every movement he made. Back in the center of the valley, the battle continued to intensify as Zarek attempted to overwhelm Matthias with a rapid combination of strikes, forcing the Scorpion King to block and step backward across the sand. The sound of steel echoed again and again while dust rose around their feet, turning the duel into a blur of motion that held the attention of every soldier watching. For a brief moment, Zarek managed to push Matthias onto the defensive, delivering a strike so powerful that it knocked the Scorpion King slightly off balance. Seeing the opportunity, Zarek immediately stepped forward to finish the fight with a decisive blow aimed directly at his chest. But Matthias reacted with the instincts of a seasoned warrior, twisting his body at the last possible second and redirecting the attack just enough to avoid the deadly strike. In the same movement, he spun around and delivered a powerful counterattack that forced Zarek to jump backward, narrowly avoiding a cut that would have ended the duel instantly. The watching soldiers erupted into loud shouts of surprise, realizing that they were witnessing a battle between two fighters who refused to surrender even a single advantage. Minutes passed as the duel continued under the burning desert sun. Both warriors were breathing heavily now, their armor scratched and their weapons marked by the repeated clashes of steel. Yet neither man showed any sign of surrender. Zarek wiped a small trace of blood from his lip where one of Matthias' strikes had barely grazed him, his eyes burning with determination as he realized that defeating the Scorpion King would not be as simple as he had once believed. Matthias, on the other hand, remained calm despite the exhaustion beginning to build in his muscles. Years of surviving impossible battles had taught him that victory often belonged to the warrior who could endure the longest. Finally, Zarek gathered his strength for one final attempt to end the duel, raising his sword high before charging forward with a powerful strike meant to crush his opponent with pure force. The attack came down like a falling hammer, but Matthias stepped aside at exactly the right moment, allowing the blade to slam into the sand with tremendous force. Before Zarek could recover his balance, Matthias moved forward with lightning speed, knocking the weapon from his opponent's hands and placing the edge of his sword firmly against Zarek's throat. The entire valley fell silent instantly. Thousands of soldiers stood frozen as they watched the outcome of the duel become clear. Zarek slowly looked down at the blade resting against his neck, understanding that one small movement would end his life. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then Matthias quietly lowered his weapon slightly, proving that he had not come there simply to kill another enemy. He told Zarek that the desert had already suffered enough bloodshed and that the true strength of a king was not measured by how many lands he conquered, but by how many lives he chose to protect. Zarek stared at him in silence, before finally lowering his head, accepting the result of the duel, and acknowledging that the Scorpion King had earned his victory. The valley remained silent for several long seconds after Zarek lowered his head in defeat, because the soldiers surrounding the battlefield were still trying to understand what had just happened. A duel that had begun as a test of pride between two powerful leaders had ended with the fate of an entire campaign being decided in only a few moments. And many of the warriors standing there had never witnessed such a moment in their lives. Matthias, known across the desert as the Scorpion King, slowly lowered his sword and stepped back, showing that he had no intention of humiliating a defeated opponent. The wind moved across the sand once again, carrying the dust of the battlefield through the air, as if the desert itself was acknowledging the end of a conflict that could have turned into a devastating war. Zarek remained standing for a moment, breathing heavily as he processed the reality of his defeat. He had spent months gathering warriors, promising them victory and glory in the rich lands of the desert tribes. And until that very moment, he had believed that nothing could stop his campaign. Yet the man standing in front of him had proven otherwise. Matthias had not arrived with a massive army or attempted to intimidate his enemy with threats. Instead, he had walked directly into the heart of the war camp and placed everything on the outcome of a single battle. That courage, combined with the skill he had displayed during the duel, forced Zarek to accept a truth he had not expected to face. Slowly, Zarek lifted his hand and gestured toward his soldiers, signaling them to lower their weapons and remain where they were. Murmurs spread through the gathered warriors as they realized their commander had accepted the result of the duel and intended to honor the agreement that had been made. Many of the men looked uncertain, because armies were not used to turning away from conquest after coming so close to victory. Yet none of them dared challenge the authority of the man who had led them across countless battles. Matthias watched quietly as the tension among the soldiers slowly began to fade, knowing that a single wrong move could still turn the situation into chaos. Among the watching warriors, Arpad stood with his arms crossed and a satisfied grin spreading across his face. He had known Matthias long enough to trust his instincts, but even he had not expected the Scorpion King to end the entire conflict by walking into the enemy camp and challenging their leader directly. Beside him, Cassandra allowed herself a small breath of relief as she watched the soldiers begin to relax. She had seen many possible futures during the previous nights, and several of those visions had ended with blood covering the valley floor. Seeing the war dissolve without thousands of lives being lost was a result she had hoped for, even if she had not been certain it would happen. Back in the center of the camp, Zarek slowly turned to face the gathered warriors who had followed him across deserts and mountains in search of conquest. His voice carried across the valley as he announced that the campaign was over and that the army would be leaving the desert before the next sunrise. The reaction among the soldiers was mixed. Some accepted the order immediately, respecting the traditions of warrior honor that required a defeated leader to keep his word. Others looked frustrated, their dreams of wealth and victory disappearing in a single moment. Yet even those who were unhappy understood that challenging the decision would only lead to chaos within their own ranks. Matthias watched the reaction carefully, aware that large armies could become unpredictable when disappointment and wounded pride mixed together. He stepped forward and addressed the soldiers as well, speaking not as an enemy but as a leader who understood the realities of war. He explained that the desert tribes had spent years fighting among themselves before finally learning that unity was stronger than endless conflict. The land they were standing on had already seen more than enough bloodshed, and there was no honor in destroying lives simply to satisfy the ambitions of a few powerful men. His words did not magically erase the frustration in every soldier's mind, but they did create a moment of reflection among many of them. Some of the warriors began to realize that the man they had come to fight was not a tyrant guarding his territory out of greed. He was a protector defending the people who trusted him to keep their homes safe. That realization slowly changed the atmosphere within the camp, replacing the tension of battle with a strange sense of reluctant respect. As preparations began for the army to break camp and leave the valley, Zarek approached Matthias one final time. The warlord's expression was serious, but no longer hostile. He admitted that before the duel, he had believed the stories about the Scorpion King were exaggerated tales created by merchants and travelers. Now, after witnessing the man's courage and skill with his own eyes, he understood that those stories had only described a small part of the truth. Matthias responded calmly, explaining that legends were rarely important to him. What mattered was protecting the people who depended on him and ensuring that the desert remained a place where tribes could live without constantly fearing invasion. For a moment, the two men stood facing each other in silence, not as enemies, but as leaders who had both learned something valuable from the encounter. Zarek finally nodded in acknowledgement before turning away to oversee the departure of his army. Watching thousands of soldiers begin the long journey out of the valley created a strange sight, because only a few hours earlier, those same warriors had been preparing to march into battle. Now they were leaving behind the dream of conquest, carrying with them the memory of a duel that had changed the direction of their campaign. As the last lines of soldiers began moving toward the eastern passes, Arpad finally walked over to Matthias with an amused expression on his face. He joked that ending a war by fighting a single duel was certainly more efficient than the complicated battle plans they had been preparing. Matthias allowed himself a brief smile at the comment, though he also reminded his friend that things could have turned out very differently if the duel had gone the other way. Cassandra joined them shortly afterward, her eyes still watching the retreating army as if she were searching for signs of danger that might not yet be visible. Even though the immediate threat had been removed, she could still feel the uneasy whispers of the future moving through her mind. The desert had been safe this time, but the growing reputation of the Scorpion King meant that more ambitious leaders would eventually appear, each believing they could succeed where others had failed. Matthias listened carefully to her concerns, knowing from experience that victories often attracted new enemies, rather than ending conflicts permanently. Eventually, the three of them began the journey back toward their own lands, traveling across the quiet desert as the sun slowly moved across the sky. Behind them, the valley returned to its natural silence, the temporary war camp disappearing as the Eastern Army moved farther away. The moment would soon become another story carried by traders and travelers across distant lands, adding yet another chapter to the legend of the Scorpion King. Yet for Matthias, the event was not about building legends or gaining fame. It was simply another reminder that protecting the desert required constant vigilance. Because somewhere beyond the horizon, there would always be another challenge waiting to appear. War drums echoed faintly over the distant desert, carried on the wind that whispered of conquest and fire. Matthias, the young Akkadian warrior, tightened the leather straps of his armor as he mounted his horse alongside Jessup, his half-brother, and Rama, their loyal companion. Their eyes, hardened by countless skirmishes, scanned the horizon where smoke from distant villages rose like dark plumes, signaling the devastation left in Memnon's wake. The wind carried the acrid scent of ash and blood, a reminder of the ruthless king from the east, whose armies had crushed every tribe in their path. Matthias' heart pounded with a mixture of fear and resolve. Knowing that their mission to assassinate Cassandra, Memnon's sorceress, would be a trial of both wit and survival. The desert stretched endlessly before them, a sea of sand and shifting dunes that concealed both danger and opportunity. As they approached the outskirts of Memnon's encampment, the golden twilight cast long shadows across the sand, stretching the shapes of tents and fortifications into ominous specters. Rama nudged his horse, motioning silently toward a ridge that offered a vantage point over the enemy's layout. Matthias studied the scene, noting the strategic positions of the guards and the hidden pathways that could grant them entry unseen. Every decision here was critical. One mistake would mean death. The Akkadians moved like ghosts through the dunes, silent and measured, avoiding the patrols that crossed their path with deadly precision. Takmit, son of King Theron, had betrayed his own people, and his hand in the trap set for Matthias and his companions weighed heavily in their minds. The betrayal reminded Matthias that even loyalty among men was fragile, and that cunning could be as deadly as any blade. Their approach brought them closer to the central tents where Cassandra was held, yet treachery lingered in unexpected forms. The subtle rustling of sand under booted feet, a shadow shifting unnaturally. These were the signs of danger that demanded their undivided attention. As they advanced, a sudden volley of arrows descended from hidden towers, cutting through the thin desert air. Rama fell first, his scream swallowed by the wind as Matthias and Jessup pressed forward in panic and determination. Jessup was seized by the enemy forces, struggling against overwhelming numbers, while Matthias fought with the skill of a man who had been tempered by both training and necessity. Every swing of his blade, every maneuver, was calculated to survive and reach Cassandra. His mind raced, balancing strategy with instinct, understanding that one wrong move could mean the end of them all. The heat of the desert sun beat down mercilessly, and the sand seemed to burn against their skin. Yet Matthias pressed forward with relentless determination. Finally, Matthias reached the tent where Cassandra was held. She looked up with eyes full of both fear and recognition, remembering the moment he had spared her life in a previous encounter. Her chains clinked softly as he moved to break them, and for a fleeting moment, the chaos of battle seemed distant. Yet beyond the tent, the drums of war continued to echo, a reminder that their escape was not yet assured. The night fell, cool and deceptive, masking the movements of enemy soldiers who patrolled under the veil of darkness. Matthias and Cassandra moved with stealth, navigating the labyrinth of Memnon's camp, using shadows as their ally. Arpid, the horse thief, who had become an unlikely comrade, guided them through hidden passages, avoiding traps laid to ensnare unwary intruders. Each step forward brought them closer to freedom, but also deeper into peril. Suddenly, a low growl echoed from behind, and Matthias turned to see Throck Memnon's captain of guards, approaching with a contingent of his men. A fierce battle erupted, steel clashing against steel, sand kicking up in clouds around them. Matthias' movements were precise, each strike calculated to survive while protecting Cassandra and ensuring their mission continued. Thorek, a formidable opponent, managed to poison Matthias during the struggle, a reminder that even victory came with its costs. Cassandra, observing the struggle, called upon her mystical powers, channeling energy that surged through Matthias' body. The venom's effects were mitigated, his strength renewed as they fought their way through the camp. The desert night was alive with screams and clashing steel, yet within it all, a bond of trust formed between Matthias and Cassandra. Their eyes met, unspoken words passing between them. Survival, determination, and a shared destiny that had begun long before this battle. By dawn, the camp lay in ruins. Fires burned where tents once stood, and the wounded lay scattered across the sands. Matthias, Cassandra, and Arpid regrouped, understanding that the journey ahead would demand even greater cunning and courage. The horizon glimmered with the first light of day, illuminating the path that would lead them deeper into the lands controlled by men. Their mission was far from over, and the challenges that awaited would test both their skill and their resolve. With the rising sun casting long shadows behind them, Matthias mounted his horse once more, Cassandra beside him, Arpid guiding the way. The desert stretched ahead, vast and unforgiving, yet filled with opportunity for those willing to fight, to survive, and to claim their destiny. Each step forward was a promise, a vow to see justice served, and to confront Memnon with the courage of a warrior who refused to bow. As the trio disappeared over the dunes, the echoes of past battles faded into the wind, replaced by the whispers of future challenges. Memnon's armies would regroup. His sorcery would attempt to anticipate their moves. Yet Matthias knew that destiny favored the bold. The Scorpion King's path was beginning to take shape, and with each step, the legend grew. Forged in the fires of battle and the trials of a young warrior's unyielding spirit, the desert sun had barely risen above the horizon when Matthias and his companions continued their journey across the endless sea of sand, leaving behind the burning remains of Memnon's outer camp. The air carried a strange silence after the chaos of battle, broken only by the steady sound of their horses moving across the dunes and the distant cries of desert birds circling overhead. Matthias rode at the front, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon while Cassandra rode beside him, her thoughts still tangled in the visions that had haunted her since the night they escaped the camp. The early light of dawn painted the desert in shades of gold and crimson, revealing a land both beautiful and deadly. Every dune hid secrets beneath its shifting surface, and every shadow could conceal an enemy waiting for the right moment to strike. Arpid followed slightly behind them, guiding their path through hidden routes known only to thieves and wanderers who had survived by navigating the dangerous lands between kingdoms. For a long time, none of them spoke, each lost in their own thoughts about the dangers ahead. Matthias knew that escaping Memnon's camp had been only the beginning of a far greater conflict, because the ruthless king would never allow such a challenge to go unanswered. The destruction of his camp and the escape of Cassandra would anger him deeply, and that anger would surely lead to a relentless pursuit across the desert. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the heat began to press down on them like an invisible weight. The desert had no mercy for travelers, and even experienced warriors could fall victim to its brutal conditions if they were not careful. Matthias finally raised his hand, signaling the group to stop near a rocky ridge where a narrow patch of shade offered a brief moment of relief from the burning sunlight. They dismounted and allowed their horses to drink from a small water pouch while Arpid studied the terrain ahead with careful attention. The thief's instincts had saved them many times before, and he understood better than anyone how dangerous the lands around Memnon's kingdom could be. His eyes narrowed slightly as he examined the distant dunes, noticing faint trails that suggested someone else had recently passed through the area. Matthias noticed the change in Arpid's expression and stepped closer, asking quietly what he had seen. Arpid pointed toward the sand where faint tracks curved around the ridge before disappearing into the open desert. The marks were not made by ordinary travelers, but by soldiers riding in formation, moving quickly and with purpose. Cassandra felt a chill run through her despite the burning heat of the desert. Her visions had warned her that Memnon's forces would not remain idle after their escape, and these tracks seemed to confirm that fear. The king's warriors were already searching the desert, determined to hunt down the man who had dared challenge their master. Matthias crouched down to examine the tracks more closely, his fingers brushing lightly across the sand as he measured their direction. The soldiers had passed through the area only a few hours earlier, and their paths suggested they were sweeping across the desert in wide circles, hoping to intercept anyone fleeing from the destroyed camp. That meant the three of them were already dangerously close to the search patrols. The Akkadian warrior stood up slowly, his mind already forming a plan. Moving deeper into the open desert would only make them easier to track, especially if Memnon had sent skilled hunters after them. Instead, they would need to take a more dangerous route, one that led through a narrow canyon known among traders as the Valley of Spirits. Arpid immediately recognized the name and shook his head with concern. The canyon was infamous among travelers because of the strange echoes that moved through its stone walls at night, creating the illusion of voices whispering in the darkness. Many believed the place was haunted by the souls of warriors who had died there during ancient battles. Matthias did not believe in ghosts, but he understood the value of a place that frightened ordinary soldiers. Memnon's warriors might hesitate to enter such a place, giving them the time they needed to move farther away from the king's territory. Cassandra listened quietly to the plan before nodding slowly, sensing that the canyon might indeed offer the protection they needed. They resumed their journey soon after, guiding their horses toward the distant cliffs that marked the entrance to the Valley of Spirits. The towering walls of stone rose like ancient guardians above the desert, their jagged edges casting long shadows that darkened the narrow path between them. As they entered the canyon, the temperature dropped noticeably, replaced by a cool wind that moved through the rocky passages with an eerie, whispering sound. The deeper they traveled into the valley, the more unsettling the atmosphere became. The wind carried strange echoes that seemed almost like distant voices, bouncing from one wall of stone to another until it was impossible to tell where the sounds were coming from. Arpid glanced nervously around the canyon, gripping the reins of his horse a little tighter as the shadows grew darker with every step. Cassandra closed her eyes briefly, concentrating on the strange energy that filled the valley. Unlike the clear visions she often experienced, this place felt ancient and mysterious, as if countless stories and forgotten battles were hidden within the stones themselves. For a moment, she felt the faint presence of something watching them, though whether it was a spirit or simply her imagination, she could not tell. Suddenly, the sound of distant hooves echoed through the canyon entrance behind them. Matthias turned instantly, his hand moving to the hilt of his sword as he listened carefully to the approaching noise. The rhythm of the hooves was unmistakable. Memnon's patrol had followed their tracks and was now entering the valley in pursuit. Arpid muttered under his breath, realizing that their brief moment of safety had vanished faster than expected. The narrow canyon would make it difficult to outrun the soldiers, especially if more patrols were closing in from other directions. Their only option now was to keep moving deeper into the valley and hope the twisting paths would confuse their pursuers. Matthias urged his horse forward, leading the group through the winding passages while the sound of the pursuing soldiers slowly grew louder behind them. The canyon walls rose higher with every turn, trapping the echoes of hooves and voices until the entire valley seemed alive with noise. Dust fell from the rocky cliffs as the vibrations of galloping horses shook the ancient stones. The chase continued through the maze of stone corridors until the canyon suddenly opened into a wide hidden chamber surrounded by towering cliffs. In the center of the clearing stood the ruins of an ancient temple half buried beneath the sand, its broken pillars leaning at strange angles as if time itself had tried to erase its existence. Matthias slowed his horse as he studied the ruins carefully, sensing that the forgotten temple might offer them more than simple shelter. Cassandra felt the same strange pull she had sensed earlier, as though the ancient place held secrets that had been waiting centuries to be discovered. Behind them, the sound of approaching soldiers echoed once more through the canyon, reminding them that whatever mysteries the temple held would have to wait. Memnon's warriors were closing in, and another battle was about to begin, in the shadow of ruins older than any kingdom in the desert. The wind moved softly through the broken pillars of the ancient temple as Matthias guided his horse toward the center of the ruined courtyard, his sharp eyes studying every corner of the place. The structure looked older than any city he had ever seen in the desert, its massive stone blocks carved with faded symbols that had nearly disappeared after centuries of sandstorms and scorching sun. Around them, the towering canyon walls stood like silent guardians, trapping the echoes of the approaching soldiers who were now riding deeper into the valley in pursuit. Cassandra slowly dismounted and stepped closer to one of the fallen pillars, brushing away a thin layer of sand to reveal strange markings carved into the stone. The symbols looked ancient and unfamiliar, yet something about them stirred a faint recognition in her mind, as if the temple belonged to a forgotten civilization that had once ruled these lands long before the rise of the current kingdoms. Arpid glanced nervously toward the canyon entrance while tightening the grip on his dagger, knowing they had little time to explore before Memnon's men arrived. Matthias moved toward the broken steps leading into the temple's main chamber, his instincts telling him the ruins might provide a temporary advantage against their pursuers. The building was partially buried beneath the sand, but several narrow passageways still remained intact, forming a maze of dark corridors that could easily confuse soldiers unfamiliar with the structure. If they were careful, they might be able to turn the temple into a trap for the men hunting them. The sound of distant hooves echoed again through the canyon, louder this time and mixed with the voices of soldiers shouting orders to one another. Memnon's warriors were close now, spreading through the valley like hunters chasing wounded prey. Matthias knew they had only moments to prepare before the enemy appeared at the entrance of the ruins. Arpid quickly helped move several broken stones across one of the narrow corridors, while Matthias positioned himself behind a fallen pillar near the temple entrance. Cassandra remained near the center of the courtyard, her eyes scanning the symbols carved into the surrounding walls as if searching for meaning hidden within the ancient markings. Something about the place felt strangely alive to her, filled with echoes of a past that refused to fade completely. Moments later, the first soldiers appeared at the edge of the canyon clearing, their armor glinting under the harsh desert sunlight as they rode cautiously toward the ruins. Their leader, a tall warrior wearing a dark cloak, raised his hand to signal the others to spread out across the valley. It was clear that Memnon had sent experienced hunters, men who knew how to track and corner their enemies, even in the most difficult terrain. Matthias remained perfectly still behind the pillar, waiting until several soldiers moved closer to the temple entrance before making his move. When the first warrior stepped through the broken doorway, Matthias struck with lightning speed, pulling the man silently into the shadows before he could shout a warning. The body was quickly hidden behind the fallen stones, while the remaining soldiers continued searching the surrounding area, unaware that one of their comrades had already vanished. Outside the temple, the soldiers continued spreading through the ruins, their boots crunching across the sand as they searched for signs of the fugitives. The leader of the patrol dismounted and walked slowly toward the entrance of the temple, his eyes narrowing as he studied the dark interior. Something about the silence inside the ruins made him suspicious, as if the temple itself were hiding secrets within its ancient walls. Inside the temple corridors, Matthias and Arpid moved quietly through the shadows, using the narrow passageways to circle behind the soldiers who had begun entering the structure. The twisting hallways created confusion among the pursuers, forcing them to split into smaller groups, while searching the maze of broken chambers. One by one, the soldiers disappeared into the darkness, unaware that the hunters had now become the hunted. Meanwhile, Cassandra remained near the ancient carvings, her fingers tracing the faded symbols, as fragments of forgotten knowledge slowly formed in her mind. The markings told the story of a powerful civilization that had once worshipped the gods of the desert, building temples across the land to honor forces they believed controlled the winds and the shifting sands. Yet one symbol appeared again and again among the carvings, a strange emblem, shaped like a scorpion. The moment Cassandra recognized the symbol, a sudden vision flashed through her mind like a bolt of lightning. She saw a warrior standing beneath a blazing desert sun, surrounded by enemies yet refusing to fall. The scorpion symbol burned brightly across the warrior's armor, as armies clashed across the endless sands. The vision faded quickly, leaving her breathless as she realized the meaning hidden within the ancient temple. Matthias returned to the courtyard, just as the last remaining soldiers fled the ruins in panic, realizing too late that the temple had become a deadly trap. The leader of the patrol had already fallen during the chaos inside the corridors, leaving the remaining warriors to escape blindly through the canyon. Within minutes, the valley fell silent once again, the sound of galloping horses fading into the distance as the survivors retreated to report their failure. Arpid leaned against one of the broken pillars and let out a tired laugh, amazed that they had managed to defeat an entire patrol using nothing more than the ruins of an abandoned temple. Matthias remained serious as he cleaned the sand from his blade, knowing that more soldiers would likely follow once Memnon learned what had happened to this patrol. Every victory they gained only made the king more determined to capture them. Cassandra slowly approached Matthias, her expression thoughtful as she explained the strange vision she had experienced while studying the temple carvings. The symbol of the scorpion, repeated throughout the ruins, seemed to represent an ancient warrior chosen by the desert itself to protect the land from invading forces. Although the temple had been built centuries before Matthias was born, the meaning behind the symbol felt strangely connected to him. Matthias listened quietly, uncertain whether to believe such a prophecy or dismiss it as coincidence. He had always relied on skill and determination rather than destiny, yet the desert had guided him through many impossible battles before. Perhaps the ancient stories carved into the temple walls were not entirely meaningless after all. As the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, the three companions prepared to leave the valley behind them. The ruins had provided a brief refuge, but staying any longer would only invite more soldiers to discover their location. Their journey across the desert was far from over, and somewhere beyond the dunes, Memnon himself was likely preparing the next move in his relentless pursuit. The wind carried the faint sound of distant thunder across the desert as Matthias mounted his horse once again. Storm clouds were gathering far beyond the horizon, promising a night of violent winds and shifting sands. Yet for the Akkadian warrior and his companions, the approaching storm might become their greatest ally, hiding their trail as they continued deeper into the vast and unforgiving desert. Matthias guided his horse through the narrow exit of the valley, glancing back once at the ancient ruins that had saved them from Memnon's patrol. The silence of the temple still lingered in his mind, along with Cassandra's strange vision about the symbol of the scorpion. He had faced many battles in his life, yet something about that forgotten temple made him feel as though forces far older than kings and armies were beginning to move around him. Arpid rode slightly ahead, keeping watch for any movement across the open desert. The thief knew the storm could be both a blessing and a danger. Strong winds would erase their tracks, making it nearly impossible for Memnon's soldiers to follow them. But the same storm could also swallow travelers alive if they were caught in the open dunes without shelter. The first gusts of wind began to sweep across the sand as darkness slowly covered the land. The desert night arrived quickly, bringing with it a strange stillness before the storm. Far away, flashes of lightning lit the sky for brief moments, revealing endless waves of sand stretching toward the horizon. Cassandra tightened the cloak around her shoulders while studying the sky. Her visions had grown stronger since they escaped Memnon's camp, as if the desert itself was trying to whisper warnings about the dangers ahead. Somewhere in the darkness, she sensed a growing conflict, one that would soon pull them deeper into a war far greater than a simple fight for survival. Matthias eventually raised his hand, signaling the group to stop near a cluster of large rock formations rising from the sand like the remains of an ancient fortress. The rocks offered protection from the worst of the wind, and their shadows created a small pocket of safety where they could rest before the storm arrived. They quickly secured their horses and gathered what little supplies they carried. The wind was growing stronger with every passing moment, lifting spirals of sand into the air as the first rumble of thunder rolled across the desert. Arpid crouched beside a small lantern, shielding the flame with his hands while muttering about the terrible luck of traveling through the desert during storm season. Despite his complaints, the thief knew they had no other choice. Memnon's kingdom was spreading across the land like a shadow, crushing every tribe that dared resist his rule. Matthias sat quietly near the edge of the rocks, sharpening his blade while staring into the darkness beyond the dunes. The Akkadian warrior had spent most of his life fighting for survival, selling his skills as a mercenary wherever gold could be found. But now the battle had become something different. Memnon was not simply a powerful king seeking territory. He was a conqueror determined to rule every tribe and city across the desert. Cassandra slowly approached and sat beside him, her eyes reflecting the distant flashes of lightning in the sky. "The storm will hide our path," she said softly, "but it will also bring something else." Matthias glanced toward her with curiosity. "What do you see?" Cassandra hesitated for a moment, as if the vision was difficult to explain. "I see armies moving across the desert. Memnon is gathering warriors from every corner of his empire. Soon he will march against the remaining free tribes, and when that happens, the desert will burn with war." A powerful gust of wind suddenly swept through the rocks, sending sand swirling into the air like smoke. Matthias stood and looked toward the distant storm clouds, his expression calm but determined. "Then we stop him before that happens." Arpid laughed quietly from across the small camp. "Stop him? The man commands thousands of soldiers. We barely escaped one patrol today." Matthias looked toward the thief without anger, only quiet confidence. Armies fall when their leaders fall. The thunder grew louder as the storm finally reached them. Violent winds roared across the desert, shaking the rocks and filling the night with flying sand. Lightning split the sky again and again, turning the dark landscape into flashes of white light. Through the storm, none of them noticed the distant group of riders watching from the top of a far dune. Hidden within the darkness, the riders wore the armor of Memnon's elite guard. Their leader studied the storm with cold patience before turning his horse back toward the east. The fugitives had escaped again, but this time, the king himself would soon join the hunt. The storm raged through the desert for most of the night, roaring across the endless dunes like an angry sea of sand. Powerful winds tore across the landscape, erasing every footprint and trail left behind by Matthias and his companions. The sky flashed constantly with lightning, and the sound of thunder rolled across the desert like distant drums of war. Inside the shelter of the towering rock formations, Matthias remained awake long after the others had fallen into restless sleep. The Akkadian warrior sat quietly with his back against the stone, watching the storm twist through the darkness. His mind was filled with thoughts about the coming battle with Memnon and the strange vision Cassandra had seen in the ruins. For most of his life, Matthias had trusted only his sword and his instincts. Prophecies and legends meant little to a man who had survived countless wars simply by being faster and stronger than his enemies. Yet the desert seemed to be guiding his path in ways he could not explain. As the storm slowly began to weaken near dawn, the winds softened and the clouds started drifting apart. Pale light appeared along the eastern horizon, signaling the arrival of a new day across the desert. Arpid was the first to wake, groaning as he stretched his sore muscles and brushed sand from his clothes. The thief glanced around the camp and quickly realized that the storm had completely transformed the surrounding landscape. The dunes had shifted during the night, burying old paths and creating new ridges of sand where none had existed before. "Well," Arpid muttered, while standing up, if Memnon's soldiers were trying to follow us. They're going to be very confused now. Matthias allowed himself a small smile before rising to prepare the horses. The storm had done exactly what they hoped it, had erased their trail completely. For the moment, they were free from pursuit. Cassandra stepped out from behind the rocks, her long cloak fluttering gently in the cool morning wind. The storm clouds were now fading into the distance, leaving behind a brilliant sunrise that painted the desert sky with shades of gold and crimson. But Cassandra's expression remained serious as she studied the horizon. "The desert is quiet," she said softly, "but the danger is still growing." Matthias tightened the strap on his sword belt and looked toward the endless dunes stretching before them. "Then we moved faster." They mounted their horses and began riding once again, traveling east toward the scattered tribal territories that still resisted Memnon's growing empire. The desert tribes were the only remaining force strong enough to challenge the king's armies, but most of them were divided and distrustful of one another. If there was any hope of stopping Memnon, those tribes would need to unite. Hours passed as they rode across the burning sands. The desert heat quickly returned after the storm, and the cool air of the morning gave way to the harsh sunlight that ruled the land during the day. By midday, they reached the edge of a rocky desert plateau, overlooking a wide valley. Below them, a small settlement of tents and wooden structures stood clustered around a shallow oasis, where palm trees swayed gently in the breeze. Arpid leaned forward in his saddle, squinting toward the village. "That's a nomad settlement," he said. "One of the desert tribes." Matthias studied the village carefully. Dozens of warriors could be seen moving around the camp, carrying spears and curved blades. Their armor and banners were unfamiliar, but their presence confirmed that the tribe was still independent from Memnon's rule. "That might be exactly what we need," Matthias said quietly. As they began descending the rocky path toward the settlement, several tribal scouts quickly noticed the approaching riders. Within moments, armed warriors appeared along the outer edge of the camp, forming a defensive line near the oasis. The tribal leader soon stepped forward from the group. He was a tall, heavily built warrior with braided hair and bronze armor, decorated with desert symbols. His eyes narrowed as he studied the strangers riding toward his camp. Matthias calmly dismounted when they reached the edge of the village, raising one hand to show he meant no harm. "We come in peace," he said firmly. The tribal leader crossed his arms while examining them carefully. "Peace is rare in these lands," the warrior replied, "especially when strangers arrive carrying swords." Cassandra stepped forward beside Matthias. "We are not your enemies," she said, "but a much greater enemy is coming." The warriors around them exchanged uneasy glances. The tribal leader's voice grew colder. "You speak of Memnon?" Matthias nodded slowly. "Yes, and if the tribes remain divided, his armies will destroy you, one by one." The leader remained silent for a moment, while the desert wind moved softly through the tents behind him. Finally, he spoke again. "Many have tried to stop Memnon," the warrior said. "All of them are dead." Matthias met the man's gaze without fear. "Then it's time someone finally succeeds." Matthias stood at the edge of the desert settlement, while the hot wind moved slowly across the valley, carrying with it the smell of sand, horses, and the distant water of the oasis that kept the tribe alive in the harsh land. The warriors of the settlement had formed a wide circle around the newcomers, their spears and curved blades glinting under the burning sun, while their leader watched Matthias carefully, studying every movement of the Akkadian warrior as if trying to decide whether the strangers were allies or a new danger approaching his people. The tall tribal leader stepped forward slowly, the bronze plates of his armor clinking softly as he moved across the sand. And his eyes remained fixed on Matthias with the calm seriousness of a man who had spent his entire life protecting his tribe from raiders, warlords, and the unforgiving desert itself. Matthias could see the experience in the man's face, the scars of past battles and the silent weight of responsibility that rested on every leader who ruled a tribe in these dangerous lands. For several moments, the two warriors simply studied each other in silence while the wind moved through the tents behind them, and the gathered tribesmen waited to see how the meeting would unfold, because they understood that a single wrong word could turn the situation into bloodshed within seconds. Matthias knew that gaining the trust of the tribes would not be easy, especially in a time when every kingdom and warlord in the desert was fighting for survival against the growing power of Memnon's armies. Matthias finally spoke in a calm but firm voice, explaining that he and his companions had not come to threaten the tribe or claim their lands, but to warn them about the growing danger spreading across the desert. He told the leader about Memnon's expanding empire, about the villages already destroyed by the Eastern King's soldiers, and about the terrible vision Cassandra had seen of armies marching across the desert to crush every tribe that refused to kneel before the conqueror's throne. The tribal warriors listened quietly as Matthias spoke, their expressions slowly shifting from suspicion to concern as they realized the seriousness of the warning. Many of them had already heard stories about the ruthless king from the east, but hearing the details from a man who had fought directly against Memnon's forces made the threat feel far more real than distant rumors carried by wandering traders. The tribal leader eventually nodded slowly, acknowledging that the danger described by Matthias was not unknown to them, because scouts from the tribe had already seen columns of Memnon's soldiers moving across the far eastern dunes during the past few weeks. However, the leader also explained that the desert tribes had never fully trusted one another, and uniting them into a single force strong enough to face a king like Memnon would be far more difficult than simply delivering a warning. Matthias understood the truth behind those words, because the desert had always been divided by rival tribes, ancient grudges, and battles fought over water and territory. For generations, the tribes had struggled against each other for survival, and that history of conflict made it difficult for them to suddenly stand together against a common enemy, even when that enemy threatened to conquer them all. Cassandra stepped forward beside Matthias, her calm voice carrying a strange sense of certainty as she explained that the desert was approaching a turning point that could change the future of every tribe living within its endless dunes. She described the vision she had seen inside the ancient temple, the symbol of the scorpion carved into the stone walls, and the image of a warrior rising from the desert to challenge the armies that threatened to dominate the land. The warriors surrounding them exchanged uneasy glances as Cassandra spoke, because prophecies and ancient symbols still held deep meaning among many desert tribes. Stories about the gods and the spirits of the land were often passed down through generations, and some of those legends told of a protector who would rise during the darkest time in the desert's history. The tribal leader looked toward Matthias again with a thoughtful expression, clearly considering the possibility that the stranger standing before him might somehow be connected to the ancient stories Cassandra had described. Yet the man was also a seasoned warrior who understood that faith alone could not defeat a powerful army, and he knew that trusting a prophecy without proof could lead his people into disaster. Matthias did not claim to be the warrior from Cassandra's vision, nor did he attempt to convince the tribe through promises of destiny or glory. Instead, he spoke honestly about the battles he had already fought against Memnon's forces and the narrow escape from the king's soldiers that had brought them to the valley. He explained that he had no kingdom of his own and no army waiting to follow him, but he believed that the desert tribes still had the strength to defend their freedom if they could find a way to stand together. The wind moved across the valley again, while the tribal warriors listened to the words of the Akkadian fighter, and the silence that followed felt heavy with the weight of the decision their leader was now facing. Accepting Matthias's warning would mean preparing the tribe for a war far greater than any raid or skirmish they had faced before, while ignoring the threat could leave them vulnerable to the full power of Memnon's growing empire. The tribal leader eventually turned toward the warriors standing behind him and spoke quietly with several of the tribe's elders who had gathered near the oasis during the conversation. The discussion lasted several long minutes as the elders debated the situation, weighing the risks of joining a larger conflict against the possibility that refusing the warning might lead to the destruction of their people if Memnon's armies eventually reached their lands. When the leader finally returned to face Matthias, his expression had changed from suspicion to cautious respect, and he admitted that the courage required to challenge a king like Memnon, with so few allies, was something that deserved attention rather than dismissal. He explained that, while his tribe alone could not defeat such a powerful enemy, they might be willing to listen if Matthias truly believed the desert tribes could be united against the coming threat. Matthias nodded slowly, knowing that gaining the trust of even a single tribe was an important first step toward building the alliance that might one day stand against Memnon's empire. However, he also understood that many other tribes remained scattered across the desert, each with their own leaders, traditions, and rivalries that would make uniting them an enormous challenge. The tribal leader eventually offered the travelers food and water, inviting them to rest within the settlement, while the tribe prepared scouts to carry messages to neighboring tribes who might be willing to discuss the growing threat. Although the offer did not yet represent a full alliance, it was a clear sign that the tribe was willing to consider the possibility of cooperation, rather than treating the strangers as enemies. As the sun slowly moved across the sky above the valley, Matthias and his companions followed the tribal leader toward the oasis, where the rest of the settlement was gathered. The camp slowly returned to its normal activity, as the warriors lowered their weapons, and the people of the tribe resumed their daily routines, though many curious eyes continued watching the newcomers who had arrived carrying warnings of war. While the tribe prepared for the long conversations that would follow, Cassandra quietly looked toward the distant horizon, where the desert stretched endlessly beyond the valley. The wind carried the faint smell of dust from faraway lands, and deep within her mind, the fragments of her vision continued to grow clearer, revealing the shadow of a massive conflict that had only just begun to unfold across the desert. Matthias sat beside a low stone near the center of the camp, while sharpening the edge of his blade, his calm movements hiding the heavy thoughts turning through his mind. Winning the trust of this tribe had been an important first step, yet he knew the road ahead would be far more difficult, because dozens of tribes still lived across the desert, many of them locked in ancient rivalries that had lasted for generations. Convincing them to stand together against Memnon would require far more than a warning about an approaching army. Arpid rested in the shade of one of the tall palm trees near the oasis, eating slowly while observing the life of the tribe around him with the cautious eyes of a man who had survived by trusting very few people during his years as a wandering thief. Although the tribe had offered them food and shelter, Arpid understood that trust among desert people was fragile, and any mistake could quickly turn hospitality into hostility if the warriors of the settlement began to doubt their intentions. Cassandra walked quietly along the edge of the oasis while studying the ripples forming across the water's surface under the gentle breeze. The calm reflection of the sky in the small pool made it hard to believe that an enormous war was slowly gathering strength beyond the distant dunes. Yet her visions had grown stronger since arriving in the settlement, and each passing moment filled her with a deeper sense that the fate of the desert was beginning to move toward a turning point that could not be avoided. Later that evening, the tribal leader returned to speak with Matthias again, bringing several of the tribe's elders with him as they gathered around a low fire burning in the center of the camp. The elders listened carefully as Matthias described the battles he had already fought against Memnon's forces, the escape from the king's patrols, and the growing fear spreading among the tribes that had already felt the pressure of the eastern conqueror's expanding empire. The conversation continued long into the evening while the fire crackled softly and the desert sky slowly filled with countless bright stars above the valley. The elders spoke about the history of the desert tribes, explaining how ancient rivalries had divided them for centuries and made cooperation nearly impossible, even during times of great danger. Many tribes believed that trusting outsiders could lead to betrayal, and those old fears still shaped the way they viewed every new alliance. Matthias listened patiently to their concerns before explaining that Memnon's strength came from the fact that he ruled a single united army, while the desert tribes remained scattered and divided. If each tribe attempted to resist the conqueror alone, they would eventually fall one by one until the entire desert was forced to kneel before the Eastern King. Only by standing together could the tribes hope to match the strength of Memnon's soldiers. One of the elders spoke quietly about a distant gathering place known among many tribes as the Stone Circle, an ancient meeting ground located deep within the desert where tribal leaders had once gathered long ago to settle disputes and discuss matters that affected all desert people. The place had not been used for many years because the tribes had slowly drifted apart. Yet the elder believed it might still serve as the best location to bring the leaders together once more. The tribal leader considered the idea carefully while watching the flames dance across the firelight, realizing that calling such a gathering would require sending messengers across vast distances to tribes that might not even trust the invitation. However, he also understood that if Matthias's warning about Memnon was true, the time for hesitation was quickly disappearing. After several long moments of silence, the leader finally agreed that the tribe would send scouts across the desert to deliver messages inviting the other tribes to gather at the ancient Stone Circle. The meeting would give them a chance to hear Matthias's warning and decide whether the desert people were willing to stand together against the conqueror before his armies became too powerful to challenge. As the decision was made, the wind moved gently through the camp, while the stars above seemed to shine even brighter across the endless sky. For the first time since escaping Memnon's soldiers, Matthias felt that a real path forward might be forming, though he knew the success of the plan would depend entirely on whether the other tribes were willing to listen. The next morning, the settlement came alive with preparation as riders gathered near the edge of the valley, ready to carry the leader's message across the desert to distant tribes scattered beyond the dunes. Each messenger carried a small carved symbol representing the tribe's authority, proof that the invitation to the Stone Circle came from a leader respected among desert people. Matthias watched the riders disappear one by one into the open desert, while the rising sun painted the sky with pale gold light. The sight filled him with cautious hope, because every messenger carried the possibility of turning the divided tribes into a single force capable of resisting the coming invasion. Cassandra stood beside him quietly, her eyes following the last rider as he vanished beyond the horizon. she could still feel the strange pull of destiny that had begun in the ancient temple. And deep within her thoughts, the symbol of the scorpion seemed to appear again and again, like a sign pointing toward the future. The sun climbed steadily above the desert horizon, as the last of the tribal messengers disappeared into the endless waves of sand, their horses kicking up trails of dust that slowly faded into the morning light. Matthias remained standing near the edge of the valley, watching the empty horizon long after the riders were gone. Knowing that the success of their plan now rested on whether the scattered tribes of the desert would listen to the warning being carried across the land, the settlement slowly returned to its daily routine as the warriors resumed their patrols and the people of the tribe continued their work around the oasis. Yet a new energy had begun to move through the camp. The decision to call a gathering at the ancient stone circle had awakened something among the tribe, a quiet realization that the time for isolation was ending and that the future of every desert tribe might soon depend on whether they were willing to stand together. Matthias spent most of the day training with several of the tribe's warriors near the outer edge of the settlement, where a wide stretch of open ground served as a practice field for young fighters learning the art of combat. The tribal warriors watched closely as the Akkadian demonstrated the speed and precision that had made his reputation across the desert, his movements flowing like water as he struck with his curved blade and avoided attacks from multiple opponents at once. The display of skill quickly drew the attention of more warriors from the camp, many of them gathering in a loose circle around the training ground as Matthias sparred with the tribe's strongest fighters. Although the contests were friendly, the intensity of the combat revealed the respect that desert warriors held for strength and courage, and it was clear that Matthias was earning the admiration of many fighters who had once viewed him as a suspicious outsider. Nearby, Arpid leaned comfortably against a wooden post while watching the training with an amused expression, occasionally offering sarcastic commentary that caused several warriors to laugh despite the seriousness of the moment. The thief had always preferred survival through clever tricks rather than open combat, yet even he could appreciate the impressive skill of the Akkadian warrior, who had somehow managed to stay alive while challenging one of the most powerful kings in the desert. Cassandra observed this scene quietly from the shade of the palm trees surrounding the oasis, though her thoughts were far from the cheerful atmosphere of the training field. Since the previous night, she had felt a growing sense of unease spreading through her visions, as if something beyond the horizon was already beginning to move toward the desert tribes faster than anyone expected. As the afternoon sun slowly began its descent across the sky, a distant rider suddenly appeared on the western ridge overlooking the valley. The lone figure urged his horse down the rocky slope at a desperate speed, sending small clouds of dust swirling behind him as he raced toward the settlement. The warriors near the training ground quickly noticed the approaching rider and moved to intercept him, recognizing the markings on his armor as belonging to one of the tribe's outer scouts. The scout slid from his horse the moment he reached the center of the camp, breathing heavily as he delivered his report to the tribal leader, who had quickly gathered the elders around him. His words carried across the camp with alarming urgency as he described what he had seen beyond the western dunes earlier that morning. According to the scout, a massive column of soldiers had been spotted marching across the desert, their banners marked with the unmistakable symbol of Memnon's empire. The army stretched across the horizon like a moving wall of steel and dust, and the number of warriors within the column suggested that the conqueror had already begun mobilizing his forces for a major campaign across the desert. The news spread through the settlement with shocking speed, and the quiet sense of preparation that had filled the camp earlier in the day was suddenly replaced by a wave of concern among the tribe. Warriors rushed to the outer edges of the valley to watch the horizon, while the elders gathered again with the tribal leader to discuss the meaning of the scout's report. Matthias approached the gathering calmly, though his mind was already racing with the realization that Memnon's army was moving far sooner than expected. If the conqueror had already begun marching across the desert, there was a strong chance that he intended to crush the remaining free tribes before they had time to unite at the stone circle. The tribal leader listened carefully as the scout repeated every detail he had observed during his patrol, including the direction of the army's march and the banners carried by the soldiers at the front of the column. When the report was finished, the leader turned toward Matthias with a serious expression that revealed the growing urgency of the situation. The message riders had already been sent across the desert to invite the tribes to the stone circle. But now there was a real possibility that Memnon's army might reach several tribal territories before those leaders even received the invitation. If that happened, the tribes might be forced into battle alone, without any chance to unite against the invading force. The desert wind began to pick up again as the sun dipped lower in the sky, carrying with it the faint smell of dust from distant lands. Cassandra stepped forward slowly beside Matthias, her eyes fixed on the western horizon, where the scout had claimed to see the approaching army. Although she could not yet see the soldiers with her own eyes, the visions in her mind had grown stronger than ever, and the shadow of the coming war now felt closer than it had only hours before. Somewhere beyond those distant dunes, thousands of soldiers were marching beneath Memnon's banners, and the fate of the desert tribes was rapidly moving toward the moment when battle would decide whether freedom or conquest would rule the land. Matthias looked across the valley filled with warriors, preparing their weapons, and knew that the path ahead was becoming clearer with every passing moment. The tribes might still be divided, and the army marching across the desert might seem unstoppable, but the time for waiting was over. The war for the desert had already begun, and soon every tribe would be forced to choose whether they would stand together or fall alone beneath the rising empire of Memnon. Matthias stood near the edge of the valley, beside the tribal leader, both men watching the western horizon, where the scout had reported seeing the distant army marching beneath the banners of Memnon. The sky had begun to darken as the sun slipped toward the dunes, and the red glow of sunset spread across the desert like a warning written across the sand. Even though the enemy soldiers were still far away, the knowledge of their approach weighed heavily on everyone in the settlement. The tribal leader finally spoke after a long silence, explaining that the approaching army could change everything if it reached the tribal territories, before the messengers had time to deliver their invitations to the gathering at the stone circle. If Memnon's soldiers began conquering tribes before they had the chance to unite, fear and confusion could spread quickly, making it far harder to convince the remaining tribes that cooperation was still possible. Matthias understood the danger of that situation very clearly, because armies like Memnon's relied on speed and intimidation to break their enemies before resistance could grow strong enough to challenge them. If the conqueror could crush a few tribes quickly and display his power across the desert, many other tribes might surrender without fighting simply to avoid destruction. Cassandra joined them quietly as the wind moved through her long cloak, her eyes reflecting the fading light of the sunset as she studied the distant horizon. The visions she had experienced earlier in the day had not faded, and the feeling that time was running out had grown stronger with each passing hour. The desert seemed to be standing at the edge of a great turning point, and the next decisions made by the tribes could shape the future of the entire land. The tribal leader eventually turned toward Matthias and explained that his warriors would be ready to defend the valley if the approaching army changed direction and marched toward their settlement. However, he also admitted that the tribe alone could not hope to defeat such a massive force if it truly belonged to Memnon's empire. The strength of the desert tribes had always come from their ability to move freely across the land rather than standing against large armies in open battle. Matthias agreed with that understanding because he had already seen how powerful Memnon's forces could be when they fought in organized ranks, supported by trained commanders and heavy weapons. Facing such an army without the support of other tribes would be nothing more than a heroic suicide. If the desert people truly wanted to survive, they needed to unite quickly before the conqueror's soldiers spread too far across the land. As darkness slowly covered the valley, the tribe's scouts were sent once again to watch the surrounding dunes for any sign that the enemy army might be approaching their territory. Fires burned across the settlement as warriors gathered around them to discuss the coming war, and the quiet conversations carried a mixture of fear and determination that revealed how seriously the tribe understood the threat. Later that night, Matthias sat beside one of the fires with Arpid, both men staring into the flames while the sounds of the camp continued around them. Arpid eventually broke the silence with a tired laugh, remarking that he had spent most of his life avoiding powerful kings and their armies. Yet somehow he had ended up traveling beside a warrior who seemed determined to challenge one of the strongest conquerors in the entire desert. Matthias allowed a faint smile to appear as he listened to the thief's complaint, though his thoughts remained focused on the larger struggle unfolding around them. He explained that he had never planned to become involved in such a war, but after seeing the destruction left behind by Memnon's soldiers, he could not simply walk away. While the rest of the desert was slowly crushed beneath the conqueror's rule, Arpid shook his head with a mixture of disbelief and reluctant admiration, admitting that, although the situation was clearly dangerous, he had begun to realize that following Matthias might lead to something far greater than the small adventures and stolen treasures that had once filled his life. The desert was changing, and the battles ahead might become legends remembered for generations. Not far away, Cassandra sat alone near the edge of the oasis, her gaze fixed on the reflection of the stars shimmering across the water. The calm surface of the pool made it difficult to imagine the chaos that would soon sweep across the desert. Yet the visions in her mind continued to grow clearer with every passing moment. She could almost see the gathering of tribes at the stone circle and the enormous armies that would eventually march across the sands in the battles that followed. As the night deepened, the desert wind carried distant sounds across the dunes, faint echoes that might have been nothing more than shifting sand or the faraway cries of desert animals. Yet for a brief moment, Cassandra felt certain that she heard something else hidden within the wind. Something like the distant thunder of thousands of marching feet, moving steadily closer to the lands of the free tribes. Back in the center of the settlement, the tribal leader stood with several of his warriors, while studying the stars above the valley, using the ancient knowledge passed down through generations to estimate how long it might take the approaching army to reach the nearest tribal territories. The calculation did not bring comfort, because the distance between the army and the scattered tribes was not nearly as great as he would have hoped. Matthias walked through the camp while observing the preparations being made by the tribe, noticing how the warriors moved with focused determination rather than panic. Spears were stacked near the edges of the settlement. Arrows were carefully arranged beside the archers' tents, and several groups of riders were preparing to leave the valley to watch the distant desert for any sign of approaching enemies. The tribal leader clearly understood the importance of readiness, and his people followed his commands with the discipline of warriors who had survived many harsh battles in the unforgiving desert. Arpid moved beside Matthias while chewing slowly on a piece of dried meat, glancing around the camp with the cautious curiosity that had always kept him alive during his years as a wandering thief. He muttered that the entire settlement looked like a nest of angry scorpions preparing to defend itself. And although the situation was serious, he could not hide a small smile while watching the determined energy of the tribe's warriors. Matthias responded quietly that the comparison was more accurate than Arpid might realize, because desert tribes had always survived by defending their lands with the same relentless spirit that a scorpion used when protecting itself from larger predators. That fierce independence was both the strength and the weakness of the tribes, because it made them nearly impossible to conquer individually, yet also made it difficult for them to unite when a larger threat appeared across the land. Cassandra approached them from the direction of the oasis, her expression thoughtful as she watched the warriors preparing for what might soon become a battle for survival. The visions that had filled her mind during the night had not disappeared, and she now felt certain that the events unfolding around the settlement were only the beginning of a much larger story that would shape the future of the entire desert. The tribal leader soon joined them near the center of the camp, bringing news that several additional scouts had returned from the western dunes with more information about the approaching army. According to their reports, the column of soldiers had continued moving across the desert during the night, and its size was far greater than the first scout had estimated. Thousands of warriors marched beneath Memnon's banners, supported by heavy chariots and supply caravans that stretched far across the horizon like a moving fortress. The leader explained that the army was still several days away from reaching the nearest tribal territories, but its direction of travel suggested that the conqueror intended to move steadily across the desert, capturing settlements and forcing tribes to surrender before they could organize any serious resistance. If the army continued along its current path, it would soon pass close to the lands of several tribes who had not yet received the message inviting them to the stone circle gathering. Matthias listened carefully while studying a rough map drawn in the sand by one of the tribe's elders, showing the positions of the surrounding tribes and the route the enemy army seemed to be following. The situation was dangerous, but not completely hopeless, because the desert was vast and unpredictable, and large armies often struggled to move quickly across such difficult terrain. If the tribes could be warned in time, they might still have a chance to avoid being defeated one by one. After several minutes of quiet discussion, Matthias suggested that he and a small group of riders should travel ahead of the enemy army to warn the nearest tribes directly. By reaching them before Memnon's soldiers arrived, they could encourage those tribes to move toward the stone circle immediately, instead of waiting for the slower messengers who had already been sent across the desert. The tribal leader considered the idea carefully before agreeing that it might be the best way to gain time for the tribes to gather. However, he also warned that traveling so close to the path of the enemy army would be extremely dangerous, especially if the riders were discovered by Memnon's scouts. Anyone captured by the conqueror's soldiers would likely be executed as a spy. Matthias accepted the risk without hesitation, explaining that the survival of the desert tribes depended on speed and courage during moments like this. If they waited too long, the opportunity to unite might disappear before the first tribal leaders even reached the stone circle. Arpid groaned dramatically when he realized that the plan meant riding directly toward the same massive army they were trying to avoid. But despite his complaints, he eventually admitted that abandoning Matthias now would probably lead him into even worse trouble somewhere else in the desert. Cassandra also agreed to travel with them, knowing that her visions might help guide them through the dangerous journey ahead. By midday, a small group of the tribe's best riders had gathered near the edge of the valley, preparing to leave the safety of the settlement and race across the open desert toward the nearest tribal territories. Supplies were loaded onto the horses, water skins were carefully secured, and the warriors exchanged quiet words of encouragement with their families before mounting their horses. Matthias climbed into the saddle and looked back once toward the settlement where the tribe had offered them shelter only a day earlier. The valley had already begun to feel like a place worth protecting, yet the road ahead would lead them deeper into danger as they raced against the advance of Memnon's enormous army. When the riders finally began their journey across the dunes, the wind carried their figures steadily eastward. Beneath the blazing desert sun, somewhere beyond the distant horizon, the conqueror's soldiers were marching with unstoppable confidence, believing that nothing in the desert could challenge their power. But now a small group of riders had begun a desperate race across the sands, carrying the warning that might unite the scattered tribes before the storm of war swept across the land. The heat grew stronger as the hours passed, turning the air into a shimmering wave that danced above the sand while the riders continued their journey toward the nearest tribal territory marked on the rough map drawn earlier in the settlement. Although the desert seemed quiet, everyone in the group understood that danger could appear at any moment because the scouts of Memnon's army might already be searching the surrounding dunes for signs of tribes or travelers who could threaten their campaign. Arpad rode beside Cassandra while adjusting the cloth around his face to protect himself from the harsh wind that occasionally lifted clouds of sand into the air. He complained quietly about the madness of riding toward the path of a massive invading army. Yet, despite his usual sarcasm, there was a hint of respect in his voice whenever he glanced toward Matthias leading the group across the desert with unwavering focus. Cassandra remained silent for most of the journey, her thoughts drifting through the strange visions that continued to grow clearer in her mind. She could almost see the tribes gathering at the ancient stone circle, warriors from distant lands standing side by side beneath the open sky, while the fate of the desert hung in the balance. Yet the path toward that future felt uncertain, and every passing hour made the race against Memnon's advancing army more desperate. As the sun began to lower toward the western horizon, the riders finally reached a high ridge of rock, rising from the dunes like the spine of some ancient creature buried beneath the sand. From the top of the ridge, the land stretched far into the distance, offering a clear view of the desert beyond the next valley, where the nearest tribe was believed to live. Matthias raised his hand to signal the group to stop while he studied the horizon carefully, his sharp eyes scanning the distant dunes for any sign of movement. The moment he saw the faint trail of dust rising far away in the west, his expression became more serious because the shape of the cloud suggested the steady march of a large army moving across the desert floor. The riders followed his gaze and quickly understood what he had seen, realizing that the enemy army was closer than they had hoped. Even from such a great distance, the enormous column of soldiers could be sensed in the slow rolling cloud of dust rising above the horizon, like the breath of some giant beast crawling across the land. Arpad muttered that the sight alone was enough to convince any sensible man to turn his horse around and ride in the opposite direction. Yet Matthias remained calm while studying the terrain between their position and the tribal territory they hoped to reach before nightfall. If they rode quickly, they might still reach the tribe and deliver their warning before Memnon's scouts discovered them. Without wasting another moment, the riders pushed their horses forward again, descending the rocky ridge and racing across the valley beyond it. The ground here was more rugged than the open dunes behind them, filled with scattered stone formations and narrow paths that twisted through the desert landscape like hidden passageways known only to experienced travelers. The rough terrain slowed their pace slightly, but it also provided some protection from being easily spotted by distant scouts watching the open desert. Matthias guided the riders through the maze of rocks with careful precision, using every shadow and ridge to hide their movement, as the sky slowly began to darken with the colors of evening. Just as the last light of the sun faded behind the distant dunes, the riders finally saw the signs they had been hoping for. Thin trails of smoke rose from beyond a cluster of rocky hills ahead, revealing the presence of a tribal settlement hidden within the natural shelter of the valley beyond. Relief spread through the group as they approached the settlement, though the warriors guarding the entrance quickly raised their weapons when they noticed the unfamiliar riders approaching through the fading light. The guards were cautious but not immediately hostile, because travelers occasionally passed through the valley during long journeys across the desert. Matthias slowed his horse as they reached the edge of the camp, raising his hand in a gesture of peace, while explaining that they carried urgent news about the army marching across the desert. The guards exchanged concerned glances before quickly leading the group toward the center of the settlement, where the tribe's leader could hear the warning. Within minutes, the riders found themselves standing before another tribal leader, surrounded by his warriors beneath the dim glow of several fires burning in the center of the camp. Matthias wasted no time explaining what they had seen from the ridge, describing the enormous army advancing beneath Memnon's banners and the danger it posed to every tribe that still lived freely in the desert. The words spread quickly through the gathered warriors, and the mood of the camp shifted from curiosity to alarm. As the reality of the approaching invasion became clear, the leader of the tribe listened carefully while Matthias spoke about the gathering planned at the stone circle, explaining that the only hope for the desert tribes now lay in standing together against the conqueror's growing empire. The desert wind moved softly through the camp while the tribal leader considered the warning, and the flickering firelight reflected in his eyes as he looked toward the horizon, where the distant army continued its relentless march across the sands. The tribal camp grew quiet after Matthias finished explaining the danger that was moving across the desert. The warriors standing around the fire listened carefully while the desert wind carried faint sounds through the valley, and the distant night sky stretched endlessly above them, like a dark ocean filled with thousands of silent stars. The leader of the tribe stood still for several long moments, studying Matthias with the careful eyes of a man who had spent many years deciding the fate of his people during difficult times. The firelight moved across the faces of the gathered warriors while the leader slowly walked closer to the travelers, his heavy cloak shifting with the wind as he looked toward the distant dunes beyond the valley entrance. Everyone in the camp could sense the weight of the decision resting on his shoulders, because the warning delivered by Matthias was not a small matter that could be ignored or delayed. If Memnon's army was truly marching across the desert with thousands of soldiers, every tribe would soon face a choice between surrender and war. Matthias remained calm while the leader considered his words, knowing that forcing the decision too quickly could create suspicion instead of trust. The Akkadian warrior understood that desert tribes valued independence above all else, and convincing them to unite against a common enemy required patience as well as strength. He simply explained again that messengers had already been sent across the desert, inviting the tribal leaders to gather at the ancient stone circle, where they could decide together how to face the coming threat. The tribal leader finally spoke, his voice steady but thoughtful, as he explained that his people had already heard rumors about the growing empire of Memnon and the destruction left behind by the conqueror's soldiers. However, rumors carried by travelers were often exaggerated or misleading, and until this moment, the tribe had not believed the danger was close enough to demand immediate action. Now, hearing the warning directly from warriors who had seen the army with their own eyes changed the situation completely. The leader turned toward his warriors and began speaking quietly with several trusted elders who stood nearby. Their conversation carried in low voices that mixed with the crackling of the fire and the distant sounds of the desert night. Matthias and his companions waited patiently while the tribe discussed the situation, understanding that this moment might determine whether another group of warriors would join the growing alliance forming across the desert. After a few minutes, the leader stepped forward again, his expression more serious than before, as he acknowledged that the tribe could not ignore the possibility of such a powerful army moving across the land. He explained that the survival of his people depended on careful decisions, and if the desert tribes truly had a chance to unite against the conqueror, then refusing the invitation to the stone circle might be a mistake they could not afford to make. A murmur of agreement moved through many of the gathered warriors, because even the strongest tribes understood that no single settlement could face an empire alone. The idea of meeting other tribal leaders to discuss a united defense seemed wiser than waiting for Memnon's soldiers to appear at their gates without preparation. Matthias felt a quiet sense of relief as the leader announced that his tribe would send riders to join the gathering at the stone circle once the sun rose again. The decision meant that another group of warriors would stand beside the others when the tribes finally came together, and every new ally increased the possibility that the desert might still resist the conqueror's advance. Arpid allowed himself a small grin while listening to the announcement, quietly whispering that convincing tribes to work together might actually be possible after all. The thief had never imagined that he would witness such a moment, because most of his life had been spent watching tribes argue and fight over water, territory, and ancient rivalries, rather than joining forces for a common cause. Cassandra remained thoughtful as she listened to the leader's decision, because her visions suggested that the gathering at the stone circle would become a moment remembered for generations. If the tribes truly chose unity over division, she could almost picture the ancient meeting place filled with warriors from across the desert, each tribe bringing its own banners, weapons, and traditions to stand together against the growing shadow of Memnon's empire. The conversation in the camp continued late into the night, while the travelers shared everything they knew. about the enemy army and the path it seemed to be following across the desert. The tribal warriors listened carefully, asking questions about the number of soldiers, the weapons they carried, and the speed at which the army appeared to be moving. Every detail helped them understand the scale of the challenge waiting ahead. When the fires finally began to burn lower, and the tribe slowly prepared to rest, Matthias stepped away from the gathering and walked toward the edge of the valley, where the open desert stretched into darkness beyond the hills. The cool night wind moved softly across the sand, while he looked toward the distant horizon where the massive army continued its slow march beneath the unseen banners of Memnon. Although the enemy soldiers were still far away, Matthias knew that the coming war was already beginning to take shape across the desert. Messengers were riding between tribes, warriors were preparing their weapons, and somewhere in the vast emptiness of the land, the ancient stone circle was waiting for the moment when the leaders of the desert would gather to decide whether they would stand together or fall one by one. Beneath the rising power of the conqueror, the ancient stone circle stood silent beneath the fading light of the desert evening, its towering pillars casting long shadows across the sand as the riders slowly entered the sacred ground. The wind moved softly between the massive stones, carrying with it the distant echoes of hooves approaching from every direction of the desert. What had once been an empty and forgotten place was now slowly filling with warriors, banners, and tribal leaders who had answered the call to gather before the growing shadow of Memnon's empire could swallow the desert whole. Matthias guided his horse deeper into the circle, while studying the riders who were arriving from the surrounding dunes. Each group carried different banners and weapons, showing the unique traditions of their tribes. Yet every warrior who rode into the circle shared the same serious expression. They all understood that this meeting was not a celebration or a festival like the gatherings their ancestors had once held here long ago. This was a council of survival, and the decision made here could determine whether the desert tribes would remain free or fall beneath the rule of the conqueror marching across their lands. One by one, the tribal leaders dismounted and gathered near the center of the stone circle, where the largest pillar stood, carved with ancient markings that told the stories of forgotten kings and legendary warriors. The leader who had traveled with Matthias stepped forward to greet the others, explaining that the warning about Memnon's approaching army had already spread across several territories, and that more tribes were likely still on their way to the gathering. The desert wind carried the murmurs of warriors discussing the threat, and the tension in the air grew heavier as the reality of the coming war settled over the meeting. Matthias stood quietly beside Cassandra and Arpid, while the leaders began discussing the reports brought by their scouts. Each tribe had seen signs of the same terrifying truth: a massive army marching across the desert beneath the banners of Memnon, capturing settlements and forcing tribes to surrender or be destroyed. The conqueror's power had grown far beyond anything the tribes had faced before, and it was clear that fighting alone would lead only to defeat. As the discussions continued, one of the older tribal leaders finally spoke with a strong voice that carried across the entire circle. He reminded the gathered warriors that their ancestors had once stood together in this very place during times of great danger, forming alliances that allowed the desert people to survive against enemies far stronger than any single tribe. The ancient stones surrounding them were not just monuments of the past, but symbols of unity that had protected their people for generations. The leader then turned toward Matthias and asked him to step forward, explaining to the gathering that the Akkadian warrior had been the one who first brought the warning that led to this meeting. All eyes turned toward Matthias as he walked into the center of the circle, the fading sunlight reflecting off the blades and armor of the countless warriors watching him. Matthias spoke calmly but firmly as he described the army he had seen moving across the desert and the destruction left behind by Memnon's conquest. He explained that the conqueror believed the tribes would remain divided and weak, unable to resist the power of a united empire. But if the desert tribes chose to stand together as their ancestors once had, the land itself could become their greatest weapon against the invading army. The silence that followed his words was broken only by the steady wind moving through the ancient pillars. The tribal leaders looked at one another, each of them understanding that the moment for hesitation had ended. The enemy was already marching across their lands, and every passing day would bring the conqueror closer to destroying everything they had fought for during generations of survival in the harsh desert. Finally, the leader who had first spoken stepped forward again and raised his sword high so that the last light of the sun reflected from its blade. He declared that his tribe would stand with the others and fight for the freedom of the desert, no matter how powerful the invading army might appear. His words echoed across the stone circle, and one by one the other leaders began raising their weapons in agreement. Within moments, the entire gathering of warriors had lifted their swords and spears toward the sky, their voices rising together in a powerful roar that rolled across the desert like thunder. The tribes had made their decision. They would no longer fight alone or hide behind the endless dunes while the conqueror claimed their lands. From this moment forward, the desert tribes would stand united against the empire of Memnon. Cassandra watched the scene unfold with quiet wonder, realizing that the vision she had seen inside the ancient temple was finally becoming real. The warrior marked by destiny had brought the tribes together, and the symbol of the scorpion carved into the stones seemed almost alive beneath the fading light, as if the desert itself recognized the rise of a new protector. As darkness slowly covered the land, fires were lit around the stone circle, while the warriors prepared for the battles that would soon decide the fate of their world. Scouts were sent across the desert to watch the movements of Memnon's army, and plans were already beginning to form among the tribal leaders about how they would strike against the invaders using the knowledge of the land that only desert warriors possessed. Matthias stood near the edge of the circle and looked out across the endless dunes where the enemy army was still marching somewhere beyond the horizon. The road ahead would be filled with blood, sacrifice, and battles that would test every warrior who had gathered here. Yet for the first time since the war had begun, the desert tribes were no longer scattered and alone. They were united, and the legend of the Scorpion King had finally begun.